Detective James Walker stood at his office window, watching the rain fall on the quiet streets of London. The clock showed 9:00 p.m. when his phone rang. It was the police station. "Detective Walker speaking," he answered quickly. "Sir, there's been a robbery at the Mason Art Gallery. The famous blue diamond painting is missing. We need you here right away," said Officer Thompson. Walker grabbed his coat and rushed to his car. The Mason Art Gallery was one of London's most famous places. When he arrived, police cars surrounded the building. Inside, he found Mrs. Mason, the gallery owner, sitting in a chair looking very worried. "Mrs. Mason, please tell me what happened," Walker said gently. "I closed the gallery at 6:00 p.m. as usual," she began. Everything was normal. The security guard, Mr. Brown, was on duty. At 8:30 p.m., I got a call from the police saying our alarm had gone off. When I arrived, the blue diamond painting was gone. Walker walked to the empty wall where the painting had been. The security camera in that room was turned off. There were no broken windows or doors. This was strange. It seemed like an inside job. He interviewed the security guard next. Mr. Brown said he had been doing his regular rounds when the theft happened. "I check each room every hour," he explained. "I didn't see or hear anything unusual." Walker noticed something interesting. There was fresh coffee in Mr. Brown's cup, but the gallery's coffee machine was cold. Where did the coffee come from? He checked the visitor list for that day. 5 people had come to see the painting. An old lady with a walking stick, a young art student with a sketchbook, a businessman in a black suit, a foreign tourist with a camera, a woman in a red dress. Walker looked at the security cameras from earlier that day. He watched each visitor carefully. Then he saw something that made him smile. He knew who the thief was. The woman in the red dress had visited twice that day. The first time, she spent 30 minutes looking at different paintings. But on her second visit, she stayed for only 5 minutes and kept looking at her watch. She also carried a large handbag that looked empty when she entered, but seemed fuller when she left. Walker checked her name in the visitor book. Mary Smith. He asked Officer Thompson to run a background check. The results were surprising. Mary Smith was actually Sarah Carter, a known art thief. Detective James Parker stood in the dimly lit Roman theater, staring at the strange scene before him. In seat 23B lay the body of wealthy businessman Thomas Reynolds, slumped forward with an ancient Roman hat placed carefully on his head. The hat was an authentic piece from a museum's collection, worth thousands of dollars. "What do we know so far?" Parker asked Officer Thompson, who was taking notes nearby. "Mr. Reynolds was found dead during intermission. The play was about Julius Caesar. He was sitting alone, though he had bought 2 tickets. Cause of death appears to be poison," Thompson replied. Parker examined the scene carefully. The Roman hat caught his attention. It was positioned perfectly straight, not tilted as it would be if Reynolds had put it on himself. Someone had placed it there after his death. The detective interviewed the theater staff first. Sarah, the ticket collector, remembered Reynolds arriving alone. He seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. The concession stand worker, Mike, provided another crucial detail. Mr. Reynolds bought 2 drinks during the first act, a coffee and a water. But he was alone. Parker's interest grew. 2 drinks, 2 tickets, but no companion? Something's not right. He then spoke to people sitting nearby. Mrs. Wilson, in 23, said Reynolds had been checking his phone frequently before the show started. Mr. Cooper, in 23, noticed someone in a dark coat briefly sit next to Reynolds, but left after a few minutes. Back at his office, Parker pieced together the timeline. Reynolds had arrived early, bought 2 tickets, and waited for someone. That person arrived, stayed briefly, and left. Shortly after, Reynolds was dead. The detective dug into Reynolds' background. He discovered that Reynolds was the curator of the City Museum's Roman artifact collection. The hat that was placed on his head had been stolen from his own museum 3 days ago. Parker checked Reynolds' phone records. Multiple calls were made to a number belonging to Dr. Marcus Webb, an expert in Roman history who had recently been fired from the museum after arguing with Reynolds over the authenticity of several artifacts. The next morning, Parker visited Dr. Webb's apartment. The historian seemed unsurprised by the detective's arrival. "I suppose you're here about Thomas," Webb said calmly. "Yes, I met him at the theater last night. He finally admitted that I was right. Several of our museum's Roman artifacts were fakes. He had been covering it up for years." "And the hat?" Parker asked.